speak English during this session. So my name is Kristian. I'm the CTO at Lumagate. I come from Norway. I'm a System Center Cloud and Data Center Management MVP, as many others at Lumagate, and I also have a role as an infrastructure ranger at Microsoft Norway. So my experience is basically around virtualization, cloud computing, and system management. And I think we will have the most interesting session during the day, this hour. So it's a lot of demos that we will go through. I will try to show you the benefit of using Cloud OS from Microsoft, or from your on-premise data center, and also to Windows Azure. So before we start, are there any VMware customers here? Good. Any Hyper-V customers? Okay, thanks. So have you ever heard about the Cloud OS so far? Some hands? Very good. You want me to talk about it? No hands? Okay. To summarize the Cloud OS, we have, in an ideal world, in the Microsoft eyes, we have 3 clouds. We have the cloud running on-premise, using Windows Server with Hyper-V, managed by System Center. We have a public cloud with Windows Azure that also runs Windows Server with Hyper-V, and we have service provider clouds that also runs Windows Server with Hyper-V and System Center. As a result of that, we have one consistent platform, as we call it. So that means we have an identical framework for development, management, identity, and data, and also, last but not least, the same hypervisor running everywhere. That gives us some advantage. So I will focus on this area here, how we can transform the data center with this technology. So in order to understand how we should transform the data center, we should look at these 2 blocks. The orange one should, or the red one should simulate the bad things in the world, like complexity and cost. Do you agree? Is that a fun thing? And also we have something interesting that I will try to demonstrate and show you, that abstraction should be integrated. So let's start with the abstraction. Microsoft, so a couple of years ago, started with something called PowerShell. You have probably heard about it, and we can see it everywhere now. The thing with PowerShell is that it's a part of a solution in the journey to a standard-based management. So by using standard-based management, instead of like the others, who's buying companies and creating one-to-one integration and so on, we have a broader ecosystem. And this is something that you will see both in Windows Server and in System Center. So what do I mean with standard-based management? That means that products are easy and safe to adopt. Excuse me. It's based on high volume components. Do you know that Microsoft are building a lot of data centers around the world for Windows Azure? That gives them some sort of power when they are talking to the hardware vendors. So they can, for example, say, hello, this is the standard we want to use. You're either in or out. That's a risk for the vendor, so they have to support the standard. And by having standards, we can solve the right problem at the right time, and we can move from planning, deploying, fixing, testing, integrating, and so on, and just add capacity when we need it. Does that sound good? So some practical examples there. In these days, when everyone is having a wide diversity of mobile devices, if we don't have standards, it would be hard to support them. So by using standard, you can use your iPod, iPad, for example, Surface, and so on, get access through standards and get all your files and applications and so on. For developers, if we look back at the Cloud OS vision, they can develop their application for the cloud or for the on-premise, and it will work no matter where it's running. And last but not least, plug resources into a cloud. That could be a storage area network. That could be a top-of-rack switch, for example. So, an example for the standard-based management into the cloud, into the data center. How many of you have ever deployed a virtual machine that should be tagged for a specific VLAN and realized it was not able to communicate on the network? Yeah? Only 3? You can't blame the network guys. That's okay. Okay. So, by using standard-based management in that context, Virtual Machine Manager, which is the component I will show you, will notify you and say, hey, administrator, you have just deployed a virtual machine tagged to that VLAN, running on that host that hasn't access to that VLAN. What to do? Well, since we have integrated to a top-of-rack switch, we can say, just fix it. Virtual Machine Manager will communicate with the switch and deploy the VLAN to that port. Good. So, I will just give you an overview of resources in the cloud with Virtual Machine Manager. Is anyone using Virtual Machine Manager? 5 or so? Good. Thanks for noticing. I thought I would have power. No? It wasn't charged. Okay, should be enough. So this is Virtual Machine Manager. I'm now located in the Fabric workspace, and as you can see, Fabric means infrastructure. I have servers, I have networking, and storage. If we look at servers, we have traditional host groups. This could be Hyper-V, it could be Xen server, it could be VMware, right? And also, we can integrate with several other server roles related to our data center. I can add library servers, I can integrate with Pixie servers for bare metal deployment of virtualization hosts. I can integrate with VSAs to orchestrate patching of my cluster and virtualization hosts. And also can integrate with vCenter. Now, that was the server part. For networking, using standard-based management, I can add switches, top-of-rack switches. Anyone using Cisco V1000 here? 1, 2. You can add the switch extension into your management here, and also use that in the virtual space. I can integrate with IPAM, so that the networking guys is able to see what I'm doing in the data center and so on. The communication are bi-directional. And also we have storage. So through standard-based management, I can add my storage area network through SMIS, SMP, or use native Windows file servers. So I can expose the storage here. I can create iSCSI session directly to my host. I also have support for fiber channel fabric, so I can take care of zoning and so on. So the thing here with VMM is that you should put everything into VMM, have a single pane of glass, so you can see the context of your resources and what you're doing. Okay, so to summarize some of the new stuff in Windows Server 2012 R2 and System Center, the thing is that you should really virtualize everything you got. Anything you don't want to virtualize today? You can speak Swedish. Okay, so I assume you're virtualizing everything. That's good. We should look at the storage a bit. You should really consider Windows Server to be a lot more than just a server operating system. It could be your best storage appliance in your data center, actually. We'll take a look at that. We'll also take a look at how you can simplify networking with network virtualization. Anyone heard about network virtualization? Yeah? So, pulling ahead in virtualization, Windows Server 2012 with Hyper-V was brilliant, to say the least. So, for R2, Microsoft wanted to do something that no one else had done so far. So it might seem like small stuff, but it's really great. We have support for cross-version live migration. If you are running a 2012 Hyper-V server or cluster today, you can create your new environment on 2012 R2 and live migrate the virtual machines into your 2012 R2 environment. We have finally support for resizing your disks while the virtual machine is running. We have automatic VM activation. So instead of putting licenses into the guests are deployed to a Hyper-V and checks if the Hyper-V is licensed, and then the VM is licensed as well. We have support for live VM export and cloning, ideal for troubleshooting, so you can just create a copy of the virtual machine and debug on that directly. We are also remote access via VM bus. So that basically gives you a full RDP experience while logging on to the console. We have done a lot about around live migration. We can use it together with compression now. And also we can leverage RDMA, which is a network specific feature at the hardware NIC. That speeds up the process. And we also have a lot more robust support for Linux, which means backup support, dynamic memory, and so on. So, about storage. The feedback to Microsoft from customers have been quite clear. One, we have just invested in this huge, expensive storage area network, which have a lot of cool features. Please, let us use them. That's one. And two, we don't have all the cash in the world, but we would like to expand our storage in the data center, but because of the cost of storage area network, that is not realistic. Okay, so how to address that? If we look at this scenario here, we have something called traditional storage. This is a traditional storage with the storage area network. We have our storage appliance here with disk through fiber channel or so on. And we present it through block, fiber channel, or iSCSI to the Hyper-V hosts. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. And to the right here, we have Windows Server file cluster. That's right, a file cluster. And we have shared SAS, JBOD, presented to the file server cluster. So that's basically a shelf with disks you present to your file server, and then you have something called spaces, which will act like the controller in Windows Server on your disks. And we further present it through SMB, which is file-based storage. So if we take a look at this, we have a traditional storage to the left with all the features we would require. Storage tiering, for example, high availability, snapshots, deduplication, and so on. And in Windows File Server Cluster, we have tiering as well. Did you know that? Yeah? We have deduplication, which is enhanced with R2 release. So you can, for example, use it together with VDI deployments now. We also have continuous availability and all the rest. So I will show you the management side of SMB 3.02 and scale out file servers and spaces with Virtual Machine Manager. Any questions so far? Okay. So back in Virtual Machine Manager, to take it from the start, we can create a bare metal deployment of a virtualization host with VMM. New in R2 is that we can do the same with file servers. I won't show it because it would take some time, so I've already done it. So if we look at the providers here, we can see that I have a scale-out file server cluster presented into Virtual Machine Manager using native Windows file server provider. Okay, so Virtual Machine Manager is able to communicate and manage my file server cluster. So from the console, I can, for example, add several new nodes into the scale-out file server cluster from VMM. I can, of course, manage my storage pools that are presented to the file server clusters. That could be shared SAS, for example. And last but not least, I can create a file share. So I will create a share now. Create it on a volume. Assign a classification and a name. Submit. Create. So that will go out to my file server cluster, create a share, assign the right permissions, and the next thing I would like to do is to make that share available for my Hyper-V cluster. Here. Okay. Okay. So now, once again, VMM will go out to the cluster and define the permissions to the share. So, what does this look like? If I take this virtual machine and go to the properties, check the hardware tab, and see the storage, you can all see that I'm running this virtual machine from a UNC path. So, how many of you are using VLAN in your data center today? Is that a fun experience? From a management perspective? No? Are there any hosters here? Service provider, okay. So, for service providers, that might result in a big mess over the years. So one of the feedback to Microsoft was that we are a service provider or we are enterprise. However, we would like some technology that enable a simplified way to implement support for multi-tenancy. How can we isolate our tenants efficiently without being limited by VLAN technology and so on? So that's where network virtualization comes into play. So you can adopt this entirely using only Microsoft technologies. We're using GRE for virtualization on the network. We have support in the remote access role in Windows Server for a multi-tenant site-to-site VPN. that also support NAT and BGP. And as I will show you later, this is all a part of the Cloud OS vision. If you have ever created a VPN connection from Windows Azure to your on-premise network, you can achieve the same thing, or you can offer the same thing if you are a service provider. So I will show you again. Has anyone tested network virtualization in the R2 one? Okay. Now, if you consider to use this, you must have Virtual Machine Manager, or you would like to have it, or else it's purely PowerShell based. So in order to keep track of the policy, if you move the virtual machines around and update the lookup tables on the host and so on, no good. So Virtual Machine Manager. This is also where you can deploy this and manage it entirely. So just to show you the setup I have here. First of all, I have some host. I need some dedicated physical Hyper-V host that I say it's enabled for, or is dedicated for network virtualization. So it's a simple checkbox. Can you all see that one? That means that these hosts should only be running virtual machines with the virtualization gateway role installed. Right? The next I've done is to create a dedicated network, the one and only network I need from the networking guys in my company. The requirement here is that the hosts, the virtualization host that should run virtual machines using network virtualization, should be able to communicate on this network. So it's a normal network, but I check this box here, which means allow new VM networks created on this logical network to use network virtualization. So basically, when you enable network virtualization, you deploy a virtual machine using virtualized network. As you can see, I have called this physical network for PA network, which stands for physical address. The virtual machine will get their CA address, customer address, which is encapsulated into the PA address, right? So I have, through service templates, deployed my virtualization gateway virtual machine. The templates are provided by Microsoft. You can also create your own. So this is the virtual machine running the virtualization gateway role. Once it's deployed, we need to configure it through Virtual Machine Manager. So I have added the gateway here. You can see it's a Windows Server gateway, the credentials, connection string to the hosts, provider, which host group do I want to associate this service with, and I also define the connectivity. So which interface on these virtual machines are connected to internet, and which interface is connected to the backend network, PA network. So once that's in order, I can create VM network. I will create a new one now and call it for Summit. As you can see, I'm basing this on the network where I enabled for network virtualization. Next, using Hyper-V network virtualization. and specify VM subnets. Since everything is virtualized there, I can use whatever network I would like. That's important. Everything is isolated. And now, configure connectivity. I can connect to another network through a VPN tunnel. I could connect directly to additional logical network using direct routing, or I could use NAT. So we'll use the gateway device I have. And you see the gateway will take an IP address from the IP pool assigned for internet public addresses into Virtual Machine Manager. And I can eventually create a NAT rule here called HTTP So the next thing would be to deploy a virtual machine into that VM network, and the virtual machine should have internet access. So I've already done that, so I've created this VM network here, customer 1, I have enabled for NAT, and you also see the NAT rule, which is RDP to this public IP address into this virtual machine on this port. So I should have that virtual machine here. So I'm now logged into this virtual machine using network virtualization. One 192.168.07. So that should be the virtual machine. Am I able to use internet? Yes. So I have internet connectivity from a virtual machine running on a virtualized network using the virtualization gateway. And also I would like to verify the NAT rule I created. So that was 27. Demo ghosts. Two sec. One test. Sorry about that. I think I messed up the IP pool when I just created a new network. Limitation of public IP addresses, of course. Now, how many of you have a disaster recovery plan in your data center? And please be aware that disaster recovery and backup is not the same thing. So when I say disaster recovery, I don't mean that you're able to restore from backup in a sufficient amount of time. It's not backup, right? So what we're seeing is that many customers do have disaster recovery, but only for the most critical systems. And they would like to have that on, well, everything that's running on the virtualized platform. Have you heard about Hyper-V Replica? Yeah, good. Anyone deploy that into production? Good. Is it working? Thumbs up from one of you. Yeah, 2. So it's 100%. So what exactly is Hyper-V Replica? It's something you enable at the Hyper-V server. It could be on your standalone server, or it could be as a role in a Hyper-V cluster. You can replicate from a standalone server to a standalone server, from cluster to cluster, from cluster to standalone, and standalone to cluster. It doesn't matter. And also, what kind of storage you have in the backend don't matter, which is good, of course. And that's not similar to the traditional disaster recovery solutions on the market. So it's an asynchronous replication. You enable it at the virtual machine level. You define how often you would like to replicate your virtual machines to your disaster recovery site. So you can configure this sync down to 30 seconds, which is almost synchronization. 30 seconds, 5 minutes, and 15 minutes. You can have up till 24 recovery points for each disaster site. And also, you can replicate through a third site. The solution will include every workflow you would expect, like test failover, planned failover, and unplanned failover. So it's easy, affordable, and a simple way to achieve disaster recovery. So whatever you put inside the guests, it's supported. We support crash consistent snapshot and also app consistent snapshots. And together with the R2 release, we got a new service offering from Windows Azure. Anyone heard about Windows Azure Hyper-V Recovery Manager? Anyone tested it? Are you using it? No. So that's basically an orchestrator from heaven, since it's in Azure. The scenario is that you have 2 data centers. This data center is managed by this virtual machine manager server, and data center 2 has its own virtual machine manager server. So if you are familiar with virtual machine manager, you can create something that we call for clouds. And you can enable the clouds for protection. And once you have enabled the clouds for protection and associated clouds with this service in Windows Azure, all the metadata from the clouds are exposed to Windows Azure. So from the portal in Azure, you can see both clouds and all the virtual machines running there and manage the failover. It's also important to note that you can manage this entirely through Hyper-V Manager, through PowerShell, through Failover Cluster Manager, with no need for this service at all to use disaster recovery. But you get some benefits from by using it, by grouping virtual machines, creating dependencies, automation, and so on. So if you are planning this at scale, you would like to consider Hyper-V Recovery Manager. So, has anyone heard about Catal? No? One? Windows Azure Services for Windows Server? I'm not even going to say that one. But here we are today with something called Windows Azure Pack. No hands? Good. Have anyone tested it, used it in production or so on? Is anyone using App Controller? Okay. So what exactly is Kartal or Azure Pack? If we remember back to the Cloud OS vision, we have this one consistent platform. Windows Azure Pack is part of it. So if we are using Windows Azure, we are quite familiar with the portal and so on. And if we should have this consistent platform, we should also have the same portal on-premise or at the service provider cloud. So as you can see on-premise, you can get the same framework as you have at Microsoft through Windows Azure, and you can get almost the same services delivered through Windows Azure Pack. So if you have heard about it, that Microsoft, they are now developing for the cloud first and then makes the solutions available for on-premise and service provider cloud. And that's what we'll see with the Windows Azure Pack, that more and more offerings will be available there as well. So enough talking. I will demonstrate the Azure Pack now. Does this look like Windows Azure? Yes. So this is the Azure Pack running in my environment. As you can see, this is not a public DNS name. So basically what we see to the left here is what we can offer today through Windows Azure Pack. So in this case, I have only enabled the Azure Pack for something called virtual machine clouds. So I can deliver infrastructure as a service. We can also deliver website clouds, service bus clouds, SQL servers, MySQL servers, and we can also leverage the new automation framework called SMA. Now, I'm logged in as an administrator, so I can show you how I can set up this Azure Pack. I have connected to my virtual machine manager server, which has, of course, a cloud that is exposed here in Azure Pack. Further, I have created a plan. Now, a plan can contain VM clouds, website clouds, and so on, and this is the part you present to your customers or users. So here's the services I'm offering. It's a virtual machine cloud. We can see which server it is connected to, the quota and the usage limit, which network should be available, and some other resources as well as hardware profiles, virtual machine templates, and something called gallery items, which is quite cool. Have you seen gallery items in action? Good. And also, what kind of action should the tenants be able to perform through Windows Azure Pack? So they can do everything except store their virtual machines to the library. So, okay, this is what I'm offering. I can have an invitation code if I like, some advertisement. So I have created an advertisement here, display name for this plan, and what the tenant should expect by subscribing here, and so on. For example, very expensive. Okay. So I should take you to the process now to create a new tenant. So this is the front end that the tenant will access. So since I'm new, I will sign up. Okay, so let's pretend I signed up. So this is a tenant view. This is the tenant. So thanks. As a tenant, if I as the provider would create additional plans and so on, they would be available here. So new offerings it is easy to present it to your tenants, and you can see the text I wrote earlier. So since this is a virtual machine cloud, I can create new virtual networks. So this is where network virtualization comes into play. As a tenant, I can sit on premise, create a new network here, and also create a VPN tunnel to the infrastructure running in this data center. Yeah, you get the picture, right? So I can configure this on my own, with no need for any interaction from the IT department. So also I can create virtual machines. I can create standard virtual machines, which is based on virtual machine templates that we should be familiar with. But also this virtual machine roles, the gallery items I talked about. So as you can see, a gallery item can be a domain controller. It can be a SQL server joining a domain, web server, or a plain Windows server. So this is where you will see SharePoint, Exchange, and so on. So just to show you how easy you can create a new domain controller, define the password. Next, domain name. So now it's provisioning a new virtual machine running Windows Server 2012 R2 that also are installed with Active Directory domain controller and has also created domain for me. That will take a while, so just to show you what's going on in the backend, if I go to Virtual Machine Manager, you can see that in my service provider cloud something is going on. There's a new virtual machine that's being created, and I can see the job here. It's the the domain controller just created. This is the owner, and here are the steps virtual machine manager will have to go through to create this. Was that cool? And it's also easy to create your own gallery items. We have a tool for that actually, a GUI. So okay, to summarize this session, based on the technologies we have available now, it's time for those of you that haven't done it yet to virtualize everything. If you have some challenges around virtualization, please confront me. Rethink storage. Take a look and see what Windows Server can do for you in the storage space instead of buying some expensive storage area network. Simplify network with network virtualization, leverage disaster recovery with Hyper-V Replica, and embrace hybrid services by using the Cloud OS and get the benefit from Windows Azure, your service provider, and also your on-premise technology. Do you have any questions? No? I'm obviously a good teacher. If there's no questions, I would like to say thank you and hope you'll enjoy the rest of this day.